Everyone has a breaking point. The moment they finally say, enough is enough. For Carolyn Stone, it wasn't the chemical plant explosion that rained embers on her small house east of Houston.
The Arco chemical plant in Channelview, 17 workers were killed.
Or the hurricanes and floods that kept tearing through her community.
Everywhere you looked, what was once a beautiful neighborhood was now rubble. People's houses exploded, their vehicles tossed like toys.
Or the afternoon the river caught fire down the street from her kids' elementary school.
Today, it is fire of the most unimaginable sort in the Houston area.
For Carolyn Stone, the breaking point was something totally ordinary. At least, ordinary for the 40,000 or so people who live in Channelview, Texas, an unincorporated community just outside Houston in the heart of America's petrochemical industry. Carolyn's tipping point came on a humid summer night in 2019. She was watching TV with her husband, Bobby, when the familiar stench of chemicals started creeping through the windows of their home. It burned her nose and made her eyes water, just as it had so many times before. But this time, the stink was especially bad. She just couldn't take it anymore.
It was just such a great feeling of disregard. You're worthless.
Carolyn was tired of being ignored by the government agencies she called to complain. She was fed up with being told, in so many ways, that Channelview didn't matter, that the place where she'd fallen in love and raised her children, the place where she had hoped to grow old, was just another casualty of the powerful industries that dominate the state of Texas.
We're basically told, you don't know what you're talking about.
Carolyn is, by nature, a very private woman. But that night, at the age of 58, she decided to fight back, even if it meant sacrificing the quiet life she and Bobby had worked so hard to build.
You fight, you stand up, you shout, you scream, and you hope someone, somewhere, listens. I mean, what else can you do? If you sit there quietly, it gets worse.
For another Channelview resident, Greg Moss, activism came naturally. He'd served in the Air Force, rescued stray dogs, made a name for himself as a hot-blooded but fair drag boat racer. He didn't worry about stepping on toes when he saw an injustice. So when barges loaded with hazardous chemicals started chugging down the river near his house, Greg pushed back against the companies that owned them. And he pushed hard.
I'm just kind of passionate about stopping these people from screwing up my lifestyle. You know, it's my life, and I shouldn't be at the mercy of some greedy son of a bitch that wants to destroy it. I'm not afraid to go toe-to-toe with some of these people. You got to stand up for something that you believe in, because if you don't stand up for yourself, nobody will stand up for you.
Carolyn and Greg balance each other out.
He's got a good sense of right and wrong. If he sees, something going on, he's going to raise Billy Kane about it. He's going to tell you about it.
She's just real goody-goody who tries to be real nice to everybody and everything. And, you got to have an asshole to tag along behind her, So here I am.
In the 2 years I spent reporting this story, Carolyn and Greg talked a lot about the possibility of retaliation against them, from barge companies or from other businesses threatened by their work. I figured it was just small-town paranoia. Then, something happened to Greg that proved me wrong.
Hello, caller? I need you to confirm the address. Do you see smoke and fire? Got you.
It's Greg Moss's place.
They did this to me, and payback's a bitch. If I'm going somewhere by myself, I got a 9mm on my side. And when I'm sleeping or something like that, I got my 44 mag. Somebody's going to mess with me, they're going to bleed to death.
I've been a reporter for 10 years, but nobody has given me the kind of advice I got from Greg last spring.
If you're out there and they get wind of your podcast and all that, you don't have any idea what these people are capable of. I mean, you need a gun. I've got guns if you need one to use, whether it's in your car or on your hip. You need to carry it with you because you need to be able to protect yourself from these people.
I'm David Leffler. From Public Health Watch, this is Fumed, an investigative podcast about the people who live in the shadows of America's chemical plants and oil refineries. This season, a group of stubborn Texans try to salvage what's left of their working class community. That's a problem, though, because they live in East Harris County, where the petrochemical industry calls the shots. If the Texas oil, gas, and chemical companies are big, shiny trains, then East Harris County is the gritty, dangerous boiler room that powers them. It's where the dirty work takes place. Oil refining, chemical storage, and shipping some of the most lethal materials in the world. And here's the thing. Every single one of us relies on the products that are made there. The plastic in your cell phone, the gas that fuels your car, the paint that covers your walls. A lot of it can be traced back to East Harris County. Part 1. River on Fire. Before we go any further, I want to tell you a little bit about me and why I'm making this podcast. I was born and raised in Texas. My father was a historian. He loved the grandeur, the almost mythical qualities of this place, and the cowboys, ranchers, and audacious oil men who made it. But we lived in Austin, far from East Harris County and the industry's ugly underbelly. I knew Texas was built on oil, but I'd never had to think about the people who live side by side with its sprawling refineries and chemical plants. Over the past 2 years, though, my thinking has changed. I've made the 3-hour drive to Channelview at least 30 times, usually with my dog Deanie riding shotgun beside me. And let me tell you, it's one thing to read about Texas's weak approach to regulating billion-dollar petrochemical companies. It's another to see that lawlessness and the communities that suffer because of it firsthand. The first time I saw Channelview, I couldn't stop thinking, why would anyone want to live here? The roads were so pockmarked by truck traffic that my Honda rattled with every turn. The stench of chemicals was so strong that I got a sore throat after being there for just a few minutes. I saw flares burning in the distance and industrial plants spewing fumes and dust onto homes just blocks away. Barges, some as long as football fields, loomed behind children playing at a popular park. I couldn't see much, if anything, that was worth fighting for. No mayor, no city hall, no movie theaters. There's not even a hospital in Channelview. Just a cluster of gas stations, churches, and beer joints, surrounded by pipe yards and industrial equipment suppliers. It felt like a place that had been forgotten, or even worse, left for dead. But then I met Carolyn and Greg. Like the other big-hearted people I came across while researching this story, they didn't have money or power or status. What they did have was the stubbornness, grit, and desperation that I imagine drove those early wildcatters more than 100 years ago. The people of Channelview, I've come to believe, are modern-day versions of the rugged Texas heroes my dad told me about. Folks who embody the word fortitude. Folks who measure people by what they stand for and how far they're willing to go to fight for it. I still remember the day I met Carolyn. I was just a stranger to her, a journalist who randomly called about a story he was writing about air pollution in Channelview. But if she was leery about a reporter from liberal Austin showing up at her home, she didn't show it. The moment I pulled into her grassy driveway, she opened up her screen door and reached out for a hug.
Hello, I was on the phone.
Hey, Carolyn, how you doing?
Good. Now, you know
Carolyn had a Texas drawl, a big laugh, and neat blonde hair pulled into a ponytail. Right off the bat, she insisted we take a tour of her flower garden. Despite the summer heat, her rose bushes were in full bloom. So were the native tulips and yellow spider lilies she'd planted over the years. Her yard was an oasis of color in the industrialized desert.
This is basil. If you want basil, I can fix you up. I just gave away 28 basil plants to the high school yesterday.
Carolyn handed me a glass of iced tea, and we sat down in her small living room. A cat scrambled past my feet while her chihuahua, Glenna, barked away. The wall behind her featured a collection of her paintings. Raccoons, autumn leaves, a little girl walking beside a wooded stream.
This is my very first oil painting I ever painted.
We chatted awkwardly for a few minutes, the way journalists and sources do when they meet for the first time. Then, Carolyn walked over to a heap of folders sitting on a large wooden table, pulled out a stack of documents, and got down to business. She was still warm, still charming. But it was clear I was dealing with a very serious woman. Armed with years of information she dug up herself. I knew then that the story I'd come to investigate only scratched the surface of what was really happening in Channelview. What I couldn't have guessed was that getting to know Carolyn and her little community would end up changing me. My perception of my work, my identity as a journalist, even my idea of what it means to be a true Texan. Carolyn was raised on the east side of Harris County, in the heavily industrialized town of Pasadena, about 8 miles from Channelview.
The nickname for Pasadena is Stinkadena. Depending on what part of Pasadena you were in, it was the smell. You know, you go to different areas and get different scents, and some of them were a lot worse than other ones.
Stories about workers dying young were common when Carolyn was growing up. So were whispers about cancer taking yet another neighbor.
Well, my dad was a self-employed contract welder. Going into the plant, you would see dead birds, and there was cow pasture. You see the dead cows.
Carolyn still remembers how her skin burned when she went with her mom to pick up her dad after a shift.
It was uncomfortable to be out there. It was like if you got a light acid on you, spilled a light acid on you. It's burning, it's tingling burning. That kind of feel, that's how it would feel out there to me.
The rancid air in the chemical plants took a toll on her father.
My dad's clothes, when he come home, they stank. Growing up, he was always coughing and hacking. He coughed up blood, and by the time it was all said and done with, it was easier to say what he didn't have than what he did have.
Carolyn's father died in 2016 after suffering for years from mesothelioma, diabetes, Parkinson's disease, and dementia. But that's how it went in Pasadena. The businesses that polluted the air people breathed also put food on their tables. Just about everyone Carolyn knew got their paychecks from the plants.
Unless you were a doctor or a lawyer, you probably worked for the plants. That's just, how it is.
Carolyn was proud of her humble roots and the hardworking, blue-collar way of life that was the backbone of East Harris County. Still, she'd always dreamed of living somewhere quiet, somewhere she could paint, listen to birds sing, or just sit in her yard. Fancy houses and money didn't interest her, just fresh air and solitude. Back then, Channelview was that peaceful place. It was only about 15 minutes from Pasadena, but compared to her stinky, smoggy hometown, it was a little bit of country.
There was trees and bushes and stuff, and all in the yard. There was woods all the way up to Market Street. All the lots around here were big and wooded. From time to time, the deer would run out onto the street.
One of Carolyn's best memories of Channelview came on a humid summer night in 1977. That's when she met a teenage boy, Bobby Stone.
I was 16, had just got my driver's license. So I went to spend the night with my cousin, and she had told me that this guy she liked at school was going to be coming over, and she was all excited about me meeting him. So, we waited all day long. No one ever showed up. Come dark 30 and everything, we put our pajamas on, sitting in the bedroom. Her bedroom was right beside the door. So knock came on the door, and we run to the door. I opened the door. Well, the guy standing there was not the guy that my cousin had described.
The guy standing in front of me had a mustache. So I'm like, this ain't this and stranger danger. So slammed the door shut. So that's the story. When I first saw him, he scared me to death. His story is it was love at first sight, but he came to see my cousin. He had a crush on my cousin. He just got rerouted.
All right, so it is 12:44 p.m. I am in my car, and I'm looking out over the stretch of the San Jacinto River that is north of I-10. We're right near the river bottom where Greg Moss lives. What do you think, Deanie? Do you have anything to say? Nothing else over here. Let's go see Greg Moss. Come on, Deanie. When I met Greg Moss for the first time, I knew he was a journalist's dream. The kind of guy who's got zero filter and cuts straight to the point.
How you doing, Greg?
All right, how are you?
It was a brisk fall day, and he was standing on a wooden deck outside his manufactured home. He lives in a marshy, overgrown neighborhood in the eastern part of Channelview. It's known as the River Bottom because of its low-lying topography, proximity to the San Jacinto, and frequent floods. Greg's thick, white mustache and even thicker head of snow-white hair were backlit by the afternoon sun. A gold chain with a gold boat propeller pendant hung from his neck. At his side was a large black and white dog he called Dog. Greg steered me to his workshop just a few feet away. He was 66 years old and retired by the time I met him. But for decades, he'd repaired boats in the cavernous room. His calloused hands and grease-stained t-shirt made it clear he still spent a lot of time there. The workshop was overflowing with machine parts and power tools. Miniature white and black racing flags hung from the ceiling. Fluorescent lights buzzed loudly nearby. Orange Home Depot buckets filled with coins sat collecting dust. A golf cart was parked near the entrance, waiting to be driven.
Let's go look at something.
Greg grinned and turned the ignition. A few seconds later, we were driving down a twisty road lined by trees and overgrown brush. I was getting a tour of the river bottom. Like Carolyn, Greg was proud of where he lived, even though it had changed dramatically since he'd moved there. Greg discovered Channelview in the early 1980s. He'd grown up on the shores of Lake Erie in Toledo, Ohio, one of the busiest ports on the Great Lakes. That's where he fell in love with boat racing. Instead of heading home after serving in the Air Force, he set out for the Houston area, where he'd heard a 25-year-old could find a good job in the oil industry. Channelview's slow pace of life appealed to him. So did its proximity to the San Jacinto River. He rented a small house in an isolated area at Channelview's eastern tip. Greg and I began calling each other regularly. I started seeing him as more than just an interesting character for a story. He was a complex man with rough edges. He was loud, in part because he lost most of his hearing during his time in the Air Force. He was blunt, and he refused to use politically correct language. Case in point, the colorful flag outside his home, showing Donald Trump urinating on Joe Biden. But Greg possessed a level of self-awareness, honesty, and compassion for others that I hadn't seen in many people. And he could speak for this slice of small-town America.
You can go in anywhere around Channelview and know people. It is a lot different than the big city, where you don't know nobody.
Greg had found what he needed in Channelview: water and freedom. Channelview only had about 17,000 residents when Greg moved there. Many were blue-collar workers and their families. People rode horses to the local hardware store. Some operated small farms. Everybody seemed to know each other. And just about everyone was white. Not many Latinos lived in the area. If you were black, you likely lived in Barrett Station, another unincorporated area in East Harris County, or in the nearby neighborhood of Pleasantville. Channelview's racial divide was reflected in a story Greg shared from his early years there, a story confirmed by others I interviewed.
That place out there on the point, that belonged to Jimmy Stanfield. He was the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. We used to just go out there to watch, you know. You could stay across the lake and watch them and shit, but they had a meeting out there. They had probably about a 5-story tall cross. And at the end of the meeting, they lit that cross up, and it lit the whole river bottom up.
Carolyn and Bobby moved to Channelview in 1981 after they got married. She was 20 and did clerical work for a company that leased 18-wheelers. He was 21 and drove trucks for the oil and chemical industries. They settled in North Channelview, where there were a few trucking companies and some train repair businesses. They rented a trailer just a few minutes from a facility owned by Texas Butadiene and Chemical Corporation. It produced jet fuel and butadiene, a colorless gas used in tires, plastics, and other products. The giant refineries and chemical plants that already dominated other parts of East Harris County hadn't moved to Channelview. Yet. There was still plenty of open space and relatively clean air. In 1988, Carolyn, Bobby, and their 2 children moved to the South Channelview neighborhood of Lakeview Homes. They paid a little more than $40,000 for their house on Lakeside Drive. It was small and old, built in the 1930s. But it was in one of Channelview's nicest and quietest neighborhoods. A far cry from the industrialization Carolyn grew up with. Decades-old trees shaded large yards filled with purple azaleas. Rabbits scurried through tall grass. Hawks and seagulls flew overhead. Leaping fish splashed in the nearby San Jacinto River. There was a big backyard where Carolyn could garden, paint, listen to the birds, and watch the kids play hide and seek. A riverside park where families picnicked and fished was just a 5-minute walk away.
This neighborhood was the ritzy part of Channelview. It was the heart of Channelview. There was the doctors and the lawyers and the better income people that lived on there. Further back in the neighborhood, Lakeside Drive used to be part of the Azalea Trail for Harris County, and that the ladies from River Oaks used to come over here then. They would host the River Oaks ladies.
The house didn't have a view of the river, but families across the street hosted get-togethers on decks and yards overlooking the water. Bobby was a volunteer firefighter back then. He was impressed by how safe the neighborhood felt. It was on high ground, so they'd be shielded from the worst of the region's notoriously bad floods. And it had plenty of fire hydrants, a rarity in unincorporated communities back then. The house was also a good 3.5 miles from the old butadiene plant. Not that they were worried much about chemical pollution back then. It wasn't until 2002, almost 2 decades later, that the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, declared 1,3-butadiene a human carcinogen linked to leukemia and other blood cancers. The neighborhood made Carolyn feel complete.
It was such a feeling of calm and peace when we were looking at the house and I walked in the backyard. It was like just such a feeling of, I'm at my granny's in Livingston. It was a big yard with big pine trees and other trees and literally the birds chirping, the squirrels playing, Disney scene. And it was quiet. I walked the whole yard just, and literally doing that, go,
By this time, the late 1980s, Houston, like the rest of the world, was recovering from a recession in the oil industry. But it was still the petrochemical capital of North America. And East Harris County was still the focal point. The discovery of oil, black gold, in 1901 at the Spindletop oil field in East Texas had made the county's evolution inevitable. It was only about an hour from the oil fields, and was home to Buffalo Bayou, a deep inland waterway that allowed boats to travel from the Gulf of Mexico up through Galveston Bay to downtown Houston. In 1914, the Port of Houston widened and dredged the bayou's southern reaches to create the Houston Ship Channel, a mile-wide waterway that served as a conduit for large ships. Soon, chemical plants, refineries, and other industrial facilities lined the channel. But much of the wealth produced in East Harris County flowed to the county's west side, and it's still that way today. The people who benefit most from the oil, gas, and chemical industries tend to live miles from the facilities whose profits fill their pockets. The first time I drove through River Oaks, a neighborhood just west of downtown Houston, it felt like I had crossed into another country. Homes there list in the multi-millions. Instead of the smell of chemicals, the aroma of fresh-cut grass permeates the air. People generally live longer there, too. According to a 2019 study by the Episcopal Health Foundation, people on the west side of Harris County can expect to live 21 years longer than people on the east side. Until the early 1990s, the southern and eastern parts of Channelview, where Carolyn and Greg live, were largely spared from the ship channel's industrial sprawl. The part of the San Jacinto that flowed along East Channelview, down to Buffalo Bayou and the ship channel, was still pretty clean back then. Blue crab, shrimp, and speckled trout flourished. Dolphins sometimes swam up from Galveston Bay. The river bottom, the marshy part of East Channelview where Greg settled, was a popular recreation spot. People flocked to the Riverside Inn, a beloved bar and burger joint. They'd swim, fish, boat, water ski, or just sit and watch ducks waddle across the street from placid ponds.
Everybody recreated on the water. There used to be a slalom course and another ski jump, and people used to water ski and do all kinds of stuff on this river like that. They used to have crab traps and shrimp boats pulling in here and everything.
Greg's boat repair business boomed.
I had so many boats. At one time, I had 3 guys helping me, and it was so crowded backing boats in here that we couldn't get in and out the driveway.
The only major industry even close to the river bottom was that old Texas butadiene facility in North Channelview, near the trailer park where Carolyn and Bobby lived as newlyweds. It was now owned by Arco Chemical. There were some underwater pipelines that ran beneath the San Jacinto near the river bottom, and barges occasionally carried sand and other raw materials upstream. Some old barges had been left to rot in a cove locals referred to as the barge graveyard. Sometimes a barge broke loose and drifted a bit. But Greg didn't worry much about that because, back then, the barges rarely carried chemicals. Greg assumed the river bottom was safe from major industrialization because it was north of the heavily trafficked Interstate 10 bridge that separated North and South Channelview. The bridge was so low that big ships couldn't pass through to the river bottom, so it acted as a sort of protective barrier.
There really wasn't that much industry around. It was all more up and down the ship channel. You don't expect anything bad to happen when you really don't have a whole lot of industry around.
Carolyn wasn't worried about her part of Channelview either back then. Houston doesn't have zoning laws to stop industrial facilities from moving into residential neighborhoods. And Harris County isn't much better. But Carolyn thought her home was protected. Her deed said that Lakeview Homes was zoned specifically for residential use. For average people in Harris County, that designation was worth almost as much as black gold. During my third trip to Channelview, I decided to visit one of the most sacred places in all of Texas. The site where Texas won its independence from Mexico in 1836 at the Battle of San Jacinto. By this time, I'd spent weeks in the area and was practically living at a Holiday Inn Express. But I hadn't yet taken the time to see the historic battlefield, an omission that surely would have disappointed my dad, had he still been alive. Now, of all places, you would think Texas would have protected one of its most revered sites from the encroaching petrochemical industry. But you'd be wrong. On a steamy July morning, I joined 2 other Public Health Watch reporters and our podcast producer at the San Jacinto Monument. We were there to meet historian Kate Johnson.
You guys chat.
The summer sun was overpowering. We had to squint to admire the 567-foot obelisk, which is topped by a 220-ton star. It's the world's tallest war memorial because, as they say, everything's bigger in Texas. 1,200 acres of preserved battlefields and parkland surrounded us, but the waterside stretches of land have been marred by industrial expansion. Kate said the San Jacinto River was between 25 to 70 feet across in 1836. Since then, it's been widened to more than 400 feet in some places, destroying habitats filled with wildlife and the river's namesake flower, the Jacinto.
When the first Spanish explorers came out, they said it was just kind of choked with these giant flowers, and so they called it the San Jacinto River.
Critical landmarks were bulldozed and desecrated, too. The tree where Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna famously surrendered to Sam Houston, it was washed away in 1924. The homestead and family cemetery of Lorenzo de Zavala, which once sat across the river from the monument, is gone too. De Zavala was the first vice president of the Republic of Texas. He also helped write the Texas Constitution. But by the time we took our tour, his homestead had been replaced by a facility that manufactures chemical tanks. A fleet of barges carrying volatile chemicals to and from petrochemical plants lined its shores.
I am talking to these folks about the history of the battleground, so I'm going to take them up to the top.
When we met Kate, she was the Texas Historical Commission's lead educator at the San Jacinto Battleground State Historic Site. Now she works for the National Park Foundation. I had to ask her, would the homestead have been preserved if De Zavala, who was born in Mexico, had been a white revolutionary like Sam Houston, the general who won the Battle of San Jacinto?
Absolutely. Sam Houston's home is preserved. He died in a place called Steamboat House up in Huntsville, and that's been preserved. It wouldn't have been turned into a concrete silo.
At the end of our tour, we took an elevator to the top of the monument. Through rows of windows equipped with telescopic tower viewers, I could see the verdant field of grass and trees where my home state had been birthed. But the view was framed by a sea of chemical tanks, ships, barges, and flares as far as the eye could see. History seemed like an afterthought. Kate said the first time she visited the monument, she thought the same thing.
I grew up in Texas, but I'd never actually been to San Jacinto. And as I'm driving down, there's refineries, and there's, giant flares up in the sky. And I started to panic, and I was like, there's no way there's a historic battlefield here.
In the early 90s, a series of disasters began chipping away at Carolyn and Greg's fragile sense of peace. Just before midnight on July 5th, 1990, that old butadiene plant in North Channelview, by then owned by Arco, blew up. The blast shot flames into the sky and shook houses miles away.
17 workers were killed.
It's a city block of blasted metal. Vehicles arrived to remove victims from Arco Chemical in Channelview. Anyone close was too close. Workers mourn but don't dwell on the threat.
It was one of the deadliest industrial disasters in Harris County history.
Inspector just came back from the plant and said that his walkthrough was like looking where a tornado of fire had run through. Just complete destruction, a leveling, if you will. Probably the best way to describe what took place.
I asked Carolyn if she felt the blast from her house.
I honestly don't recall. It's sad. There are so many explosions and stuff that I don't recall them all. It's crazy. And that, to me, is a statement of conditioning. That's a horrible reality. I won't even say statement. It's a horrible reality.
Two years after the Arco explosion, an F4 tornado tore through Channelview.
While the twisters moved west to east indiscriminately across much of Harris County, clearly the greatest amount of devastation was suffered in Channelview in East Harris County.
The streets here are flooded with slime and muck, and there is debris everywhere.
The nearly mile-wide twister destroyed at least 1,000 homes and businesses. Luckily, it didn't hit any petrochemical facilities or touch Carolyn or Greg's neighborhoods. Houston meteorologist and Space City Weather managing editor Matt Lanza said it was the strongest tornado in the Houston area on record, and a jolting reminder of Channelview's vulnerability to severe weather.
You know, you don't really think of tornadoes as being a threat here, but Channelview is kind of located in an interesting little area that I think is more susceptible to maybe tornadoes happening more frequently than other parts of the Houston area because of their proximity to water. For the Houston area, I think that east side up through Channelview is kind of like our tornado alley. I mean, it's just something else to think about, right, among all the disasters that we have here.
The next disaster in 1993, a year after the tornado, was a very personal one for Carolyn. Carolyn had long accepted the fact that her husband took on dangerous jobs, volunteering as a firefighter and driving trucks in the oil and chemical industries.
I mean, he hauled some chemicals that you had an antidote that you had to have, but you really didn't have time to administer the antidote because if a drop of it got on you, you were basically dead within just a few seconds. What are you going to do? But I mean, he was a firefighter shortly after I started dating him. So it's always been part of the deal. So, yeah, you make peace with it, I guess.
Carolyn said Bobby always followed safety protocols to a T. But when you're working with some of the most volatile materials in the world, any day could be your last, even when you do everything right. It took a series of phone calls for Carolyn to tell me what happened to Bobby on September 28th, 1993. She was leaving work for her lunch break when she spotted something burning in the distance at one of Bobby's job sites.
As I pull out of the parking lot, I see the black cloud coming up over the tunnel. And I knew Bobby was there. That was my first thought. That facility had blown up. I could see the flames and stuff above the tree line.
Carolyn scrambled to find a payphone. But when she called the facility, they couldn't confirm if Bobby was on the premises, let alone if he had been injured. She was told to stand by for more information.
You talk about people who they have the premonition or the feeling or whatever. I truly did. I started getting sick. I see smoke and explosions all the time. But in my heart of hearts, I knew he was there. There was no doubt. When I pulled in at work, they greeted me at the door and told me that a man had called and that, yes, Bobby had been in an explosion.
It turns out that Bobby was at a fuel loading facility when the engine of a coworker's truck ignited gasoline vapors that were hanging in the air. It caused a massive explosion. The two men had to be life-flighted to a burn center in Houston.
I do not know how I made it to Herman Hospital because I remember leaving the parking lot and I remember walking in the emergency room. I was on total automatic. I'm standing in the doorway of the room and Bobby's laying on the bed, the table there. Doctors running all around. He's got tubes and the stuff off in him. and literally his skin is laying on the bed beside him.
Bobby didn't want to be interviewed for this podcast. Carolyn said it's still difficult for him to talk about that day. It's tough for her, too. She laughs when she's upset.
Sorry. I'm getting a little upset. There was a long recovery period. Not sure we're still quite recovered.
On October 20th, 1994, a little over a year after Bobby's accident, one of the biggest floods in Channelview history swept through the area. Channelview, especially the river bottom where Greg lived, has always been vulnerable to floods. It's sandwiched between the Gulf of Mexico, whose warm, shallow waters often fuel hurricanes, and the Lake Houston Dam. During heavy rainstorms, the dam's floodgates are opened to protect the homes of wealthy people who live near the lake. The wall of water the gates release hurtles downstream toward Channelview. The floods are so frequent there that Greg uses hurricanes as reference points for major events in his life. But October 20th, 1994 was unlike any flood Greg had ever seen.
Roads are cut off and the water is still rising. The river has risen faster than anybody can remember.
We talked about it one day under the buzz of the fluorescent lights in his workshop, while his companion, Dog, and Deanie ran around. Greg estimates the San Jacinto's waters rushed by the river bottom at about 30 miles an hour. He and some friends jumped into boats and formed a ragtag rescue team. They saved people, but also...
Me and Ross and Smitty and Wayne and several others were out pulling emus because the guy had an emu farm up there. And back then it was like, those things were like 20 grand a piece. They were alive. The water cut through where all their pens were. So we were out there grabbing them things by the neck and getting them on the shoreline and holding them.
As the floodwaters rose, Carolyn felt safe in her house. It sits on some of the highest ground in Channelview. But her feeling of safety was shattered the next afternoon when there was a terrifying development.
In San Jacinto River, east of Channelview.
Trees and homes are engulfed. Residents and nearby refinery workers flee the fast-moving flames.
Just yesterday, we were talking about floods. Today, it is fire of the most unimaginable sort in the Houston area.
All of this began early this morning when a pipeline ruptured on the San Jacinto River.
You heard that right. The San Jacinto River was on fire. According to dozens of people who told me about that day, the hard rains and flooding dislodged an old sand barge from that barge graveyard upstream near the river bottom. As the barge hurtled south, it slammed into a 40-inch pipeline that had floated to the top of the river as the water rose. Greg watched from a hill as hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline gushed into the river and then ignited.
You could smell all the gasoline all over the water, and it was big pools of it. I mean, it looked like it was several inches thick, like football field-sized pools, several inches thick of gasoline. They had a bunch of trailers parked along the water line, and the gas fumes got into a pilot light or a generator exhaust or something, and it just, man, in a fire, it just shot out. The news helicopter said it was running 85 miles an hour. The flame front. He was probably doing every bit of that.
Greg saw flaming floodwaters 10 feet high rush into the river bottom.
And then the fire spread into a neighborhood of residential homes that had already been inundated by floodwaters. There was fire on the water. There was gasoline in the water. There were fires popping up on one side of the street. And it seemed like the entire world was on fire. Thick black smoke, as you can imagine, pouring into the sky.
Greg did what any smart person would do. He ran.
You know, I had a Pontiac Fiero at the time. You know, that was my little getter-arounder, and then I had my pickup truck. But I was driving that Fiero that day, and we got in it, and we just hauled ass up towards that Shell station. I mean, there was fire everywhere, and it was just kept going boom, 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 you know, and a big old black clouds of smoke and everything. And we hauled down the road. I grabbed Will. He was the handyman over there at the bar. I said, get in here, let's go, you know. We run down Magnolia Street. My buddy Dale, he was dead run. I said, get on. He jumped on the luggage rack of the car and we hauled up to the Shell station.
While Greg was running away from the flames, Carolyn was running toward them. Her children's elementary school was close to the river. It was also less than a mile from the rebuilt Arredondo plant. And the river fire was headed that way.
When I got to the school, there was already a bunch of parents there. You have a whole group of parents who are beating on the door wanting to get their kids. The school has the doors locked and yelling at us, telling us we can't have our kids, that they were doing shelter in place. There was the river on fire right down at the end of the road, and they're like trying to tell us to leave. Who in their right mind would leave their kids?
The fire finally burned itself out around 6 p.m. A 10-mile oil slick covered the river from north of Interstate 10 through the Houston Ship Channel to the northern stretches of Galveston Bay. The river bottom was in shambles. Trees charred, homes gone. Greg's first workshop was burned to a crisp.
It was crazy. You never really experience anything till you watch a river catch fire. It was weird.
The river fire of '94 became a sort of marker for Channelview residents. The time when the good old days began fading away, and the industrial takeover truly began. Next time on Fumed, a barge company moves in across the street from Carolyn, sparking a desperate fight to preserve her peaceful way of life.
It was like a moment of extreme desperation. It's like being in the penthouse of a skyscraper in the elevator and the brakes failing and you're plummeting down. There's no stopping it, but you're grasping and you're pushing buttons.
Fumed is a production of Public Health Watch. It was written and reported by me, David Leffler. Additional reporting by Savanna Strott and Salina Arredondo. Susan White was my editor. Our executive producer was Jordan Gass-Pooré. Our senior producer was Salina Arredondo. Savanna Strott was an assistant producer. Jana Cholakovska and Jordan Gass-Pooré provided additional research. Our music was composed and performed by Michael Ramos. Additional music by Epidemic Sound. Mark Bush was our sound engineer. Fact-checking by Ina Alvarado. Artwork by Matthew Fleming. Special thanks to our distribution partners at Texas Public Radio and to the Texas Tribune for studio and technical support. Also, thanks to Joanne Farian, Lynn Perry, and Chris Worthington for their advice and encouragement. Jim Morris is the executive director and editor-in-chief of Public Health Watch. To see pictures of Carolyn and Greg and learn more about Channelview, go to fumedpodcast.com.